When it comes to neutrals, at a high level, if you are in a cool season, you're gonna be in grays, charcoals, silver, black if you're a winter. If you are in a warm season, you're going to be in some kind of brown. Warm brown, cool gray. Now let's take a look at each of the home seasons as well as each of the flows. If your home season is summer, as we already have discussed, your colors all have a touch of gray in them. So gray is where you get to play. You're gonna have a variety of grays, blue grays, sort of neutral leaning grays, light grays. The key here is not to go too far into the land of charcoal, dark gray, blacks. You want to avoid going too dark because that's going to tug you into the cool palette and up toward winter. Now winter's a little bit of a different story because winter colors are all very intense, so there's no gray added to them necessarily. We get our winter colors by adding either black to a color or white to a color, so either a shade or a tint, and that's what keeps them really intense. So when you have a winter charcoal, it's not because straight up gray has been added to it, it is just black having been added to gray, which sounds a little bit strange to say out loud, but it's a very rich, deep kind of charcoal. On the other hand, you also have these really icy silver grays. So for comparison, you see how muted and soft a summer gray is and how icy and clear and crisp a winter silver is. And yes, if you are a winter, you are the envy of us all and you get black. Now let's jump to our warm home seasons, which are either going to be autumn or spring. So autumn is going to also have gray in it. Autumn is the softer of the two warm seasons, and browns are where browns come to life in the autumn season. We have a lot of gorgeous, rich browns here. We have a very dark, soft, chocolatey brown. We have a very spicy, reddish, earthy brown. We've got all different varieties of these sort of dark and tan and khaki browns. All of these very spicy, warm, rich browns are gonna live in the autumn home season. So how do you make the jump from autumn to spring? So spring's colors, by comparison, very, very bright. There's no gray or black added to spring. All of spring's colors you get by adding white to the original hue. So when you think about that and we look at the spring colors, you're gonna see this is where we get tan and camel colors and a nice goldish sort of a brown, of even like a champagne kind of a color. If you have a warm home season, gray is just not your jam. Even if your home season is autumn, where I've said this is a softer season and gray has been added to all of these colors, gray itself as something for you to wear is not going to be in your best color palette. So the simple way to remember that, cool seasons, grays, warm seasons, browns. But now let's get into the flows. The easiest flows to keep straight are going to be the warm palette and the cool palette for the obvious reason. So the warm palette is going to basically split the difference between the light sort of tans and champagne neutrals of spring and those deep, rich, earthy browns of autumn by giving you these colors that kind of, like I said, fall right between them. So it's richer than a tan and a camel, but not quite as rich and deep as some of the autumn colors, but still fully warm colors, all browns. The cool palette is exactly the same thing, splitting the difference between summer and winter. So remember we said winter has really rich charcoals, stark black, white, really silvery grays. Summer has more muted grays, softer grays, and not super deep charcoals. The cool palette is gonna split the difference by giving you a couple of charcoal options and a couple of silvery options that aren't quite as icy as winters, but they are a little bit icier than summers. And the thing to keep in mind here too is we really do get down into the nitty-gritty of splitting hairs. So if you were a summer, for example, is this too silvery for you? Kind of depends on the person and where they fall in that summer home season. But again, fully cool colors, no browns at all in the cool palette. So the fun thing about our remaining 4 flow palettes is that they are all neutral, which means they aren't gonna be fully over in the grays and they're not gonna be fully over in the browns. They're landing somewhere in the middle, where instead of having maybe a really warm brown, you're gonna have a more neutral brown. Or instead of having a fully cool gray, you might have like a grayish is what I've come to call it. So let's take a look at some drapes. Let's start by comparing the bright and soft palette, which are exactly what they sound like. The brightest palette sits between winter and spring, our 2 bright home seasons. So they have characteristics of both, and that makes them neutral and very bright. So this is a neutral black brown is sort of what I call it. You see people with really dark hair this color. If it's not quite all the way black, there's just a little bit of brown in it. So neutral, not all the way black, not all the way brown, a mix of the two. Same with this one, which may be hard to tell on camera, but this to me is a bit of a blend of a gray and an ivory. So spring is going to have ivory or an off-white instead of a true white like winter. And if you were to mix that with winter's silvery gray, you would end up with this color. So it's kind of a neutral dove gray almost. Now, if we jump down to the soft palette, you can see how bright these colors are. There's no gray added to them. And then you have the soft palette's answer to these. So in the soft palette, this is the color that I always think of as grayish, or for some reason it makes me think of Earl Grey. Maybe that's just because of the color of the tea box that I used to get. But if you're in a neutral palette, you're gonna have colors that will bump toward cool and bump toward warm. And here you can kind of see this splitting the difference. This will bump toward summer because there's more gray in it, whereas this one will bump toward autumn because there's just a little bit more brown in it. You can see they're side by side. And just as a reminder, the soft palette is the one that sits between summer and autumn. So it's the neutral flow between the soft seasons. And last but not least, let's talk about the deep palette and the light palette. So both neutral. The deep one sits between winter and autumn. And so here again, you're gonna see a little bit of influence from both, but the colors are neutral. So if we look at this brown, it has a little bit of a redness to it, but not as rich and earthy as all of the brown drapes that we saw from the autumn palette. And likewise, you're gonna have this gorgeous champagne color that has more of like an oatmeal, an oat color kind of an influence from autumn than that super icy silver that we saw from winter. But if you were to mix like a cream with winter's icy silver, this would be the color that you get. Now, if we pop up to the light palette, so this is the one that is splitting the difference between spring and summer. So it's a little bit brighter and a little bit warmer than summer, but a little bit softer and a little bit cooler than spring. So here again, you kind of get a sampling of both. You're gonna have a very light brown, light as compared to some of our other seasons, but it's a neutral brown. It's not as warm and golden as those ones we looked at from the spring palette. And likewise, this gray, again, it's sort of splitting the difference between a spring ivory and a summer gray. So whenever you're out and about, if you are in a neutral palette and you're looking at a piece of clothing or a makeup item and you're trying to decide if it's neutral or not, what you're gonna wanna do is set it next to something that you know is cool or that you know is warm and let it sort of show you for itself. So let's do a quick example using the deep palette. So as I said, we have this really nice dark neutral brown from the deep palette. And looking at that just on its own, you might say that's a pretty warm brown. But if I grab a brown from the autumn drapes for comparison and I put it side by side, what you can see right away is how much more yellow in this case is in this brown, making it much warmer and less neutral. And if we look at another one that has a more red base to it, you'll see the same effect. This here, standing on its own, we might just think of it as a brown, but when you put it next to this, you can see how rich and red and earthy this one is. And this is called color relativity, when you put two colors side by side and you're suddenly able to see the warmth, the coolness, or the neutrality of a color as compared to another color. That's what's going to tip you off. So I hope this helped clear up the conversation about neutrals, as it were. Not all neutrals are neutral in undertone, but every season has its own neutrals to be included in the wardrobe. So leave me questions in the comments. Let me know other comparisons that you want to see that I can do a deep dive on for you guys, and I'll be back with another style video soon.